On the quiet shores of the Baltic hides a place that still resonates with the echoes of barbarism. Stutthof, a concentration camp whose history is marked by unspeakable cruelty and the darkest crimes of the Nazi regime. Created initially a detention center, Stutthof was transformed into a death, where thousands of men, women, and children faced inhumane conditions, forced labor, and mass executions. However, what distinguishes Stutthof from other fields is the role of their female guards. Young women, many recruited from the German Girls' League, became perpetrators of atrocious crimes, carrying out abuses and murders with chilling coldness. Their ruthless acts and active participation in the brutality of the camp became a symbol of the banality of evil. Today, we will explore the history of Stutthof and the brutal executions of these guards, a chapter of history that reveals the darkest limits of human nature. Sean All.
Welcome to the General Memories.
Stutthof, hell on the Baltic coast. Stutthof, located near the Polish city of Gdansk, was the first training camp. Concentration established outside the borders of Germany and one of the last to be released. Its creation in 1939, just days after the Nazi invasion of Poland, marked the beginning of a brutal chapter in the history of the Second World War. Originally conceived as a detention center for Polish intellectual elite, Stutthof soon evolved into a peace key to the genocidal machinery of the Third Reich. This was initially designed to house a few hundred prisoners. Stutthof grew rapidly in size and capacity. Between 1,900 and 42,944, the field expanded to include cameras of gas, crematoriums, and a vast network of subcamps. These facilities reflected the transformation of Stutthof into an extermination camp where thousands of Jews, Poles, Soviet, and prisoners of war of other nationalities were to be systematically murdered. By the end of the war, more than 110,000 people had passed through the gates of Stutthof. Of them, it is estimated that 65,000, that is more than half, never they came out alive. Malnutrition, disease, and brutal living conditions claimed the lives of thousands, while others perished in mass executions organized by the Nazis. Life at Stutthof was designed to break both body and spirit. Prisoners. Since their arrival, they were subjected to a process of total dehumanization. They were stripped of their belongings, assigned a number, and forced to wear striped uniforms that made them mere shadows of their previous identity. Hunger was a constant in the countryside. The daily rations consisted of a piece of stale bread and a watery soup that barely contained any nutrients. The prisoners worked long hours in grueling conditions, whether building infrastructure for the field, manufacturing ammunition, or carrying out agricultural tasks. Those who weakened too much were marked for elimination. A testimony from a survivor, collected in 1945, describes the impact of these conditions. "We were like living skeletons. Every step it was a fight. Hunger not only consumed us physically, but also it stole our humanity." The cold of winter in the Baltic region further aggravated the suffering of the prisoners. With inadequate clothing and poorly constructed shelters, many succumbed to diseases such as pneumonia and tuberculosis. Now, having said this context, we will tell something that at that time seemed unthinkable. In 1942, a new figure emerged in the structure of Stutthof, the Offizierinnen, or female guards. Often recruited from the League of German Girls known as BDM, these young women were trained to supervise the prisoners and maintain order in the camp. Although initially their numbers were limited, female guards played an increasingly important role. Prominent as the field grew, the Offizierinnen were in charge of guarding the prisoners and, in turn, participated actively in punishments and executions. Some earned a reputation for their cruelty, using sadistic methods to inflict suffering. Among them was Jenny Wanda Barkman, known for her attractive appearance but ruthless attitude, who frequently selected prisoners for the gas chamber with a smile on his face. The female guards also supervised the prisoners' tasks in the factories and workshops in the countryside. They were known to impose physical punishment for the slightest error, using whips and other instruments. His presence at Stutthof defied the traditional perception of women as figures of compassion and care, demonstrating that Nazi ideology could corrupt even the most basic values of humanity. However, a question arises. What was the ultimate purpose of Stutthof? Well, by 1944, with the advance of the Red Army, the Nazis, they intensified efforts to destroy any evidence of their crimes in Stutthof. However, mass executions continued until the last days of the field. As prisoners were sent on death marches to others' fields or into the interior of Germany, the horror of Stutthof extended beyond its borders. And that will be the next thing we will cover. What were those known as death marches, and what did they imply on a physical and mental level? Death marches, the last days of horror. In the final months of World War II, when the Nazi defeat was becoming inevitably, the concentration camps became scenes of horror still elderly. The so-called death marches were implemented as an attempt desperate of the Nazis to evacuate the camps, hide evidence of their crimes, and prevent the prisoners from being freed by the Allied forces. Stutthof was not the exception. Between the end of 1944 and the beginning of 1944, 945, tens of thousands of prisoners were forced to walking long distances in extreme conditions. Now we ask ourselves, how did these marches start? Reports say that in September 1944, when Soviet forces began to approach the Baltic, the Nazis ordered the partial evacuation of Stutthof. The prisoners, weakened by years of malnutrition and forced labor, they were taken from the field and forced to travel kilometers in the freezing cold. Our marches, known as death marches, spread throughout the months following, until Stutthof was finally liberated in May 1945. However, the purpose of these marches was twofold. To prevent the prisoners' survivors will testify about Nazi crimes and continue to use their strength labor in other fields or factories. However, for the prisoners, these marches, they meant an even deeper descent into suffering, and that will be what we will count below. These marches were conducted under brutal conditions. The prisoners were forced to walk for endless days, often without food or water. Those who collapsed from exhaustion or illness were executed, crudely on the spot by the guards. The testimonies collected after the war describe scenes of horror, bodies abandoned on the roads, women and children dying of cold, and guards mercilessly imposing punishments for the most minimal act of weakness. One survivor, identified as Mikhail T., described his experience. "We walked without rest, with our feet bleeding and our bodies shaking with cold. Those who fell received no help, only the shot of a rifle. Some of us, we were wondering if it would be better to stop walking and accept the end." The weather conditions aggravated the suffering. During the winter of 1944, temperatures in the Baltic region fell by below 20 degrees below zero. The prisoners, dressed in rags and without proper footwear, they struggled to survive constant exposure to the cold. On the other hand, in these marches, the female guards played an active role in the surveillance and execution of prisoners. The Officerinnen, trained in the use of weapons and indoctrinated with Nazi ideology, they supervised the groups of prisoners along with the male guards. Many of them stood out for their cruelty, using whips and rifles to maintain control over the columns. A testimony from Sarah B., a Polish survivor, describes the behavior of A of these guards. "I remember a woman who watched us. He would hit us if we didn't. We walked fast enough. Once I saw how he shot a mother who he had fallen to the ground with his son in his arms. His face showed no emotion." Jenny Wanda Barkman, nicknamed the Beautiful Spectre, of which later we will talk much more in depth, it is remembered as one of the most brutal during the Stutthof marches. According to testimonies, Barkman not only executed prisoners, but who did it with apparent satisfaction. A post-trial report of 1946 detailed how Barkman participated in the selection of prisoners who could not continue walking, condemning them to be executed in the act. Furthermore, a recent discovery in German archives shed light on a strategy used by the Nazis during these marches. The routes were planned to pass through unpopulated areas with the aim of minimizing the number of witnesses. However, some local residents witnessed the horror. A German peasant who lived near one of the routes declared years later, "We saw them passing from the distance. We couldn't get close, but we knew they were dying." The silence was broken only by gunshots and screams. Another significant discovery came from documents declassified in 2018, which revealed how female guards received incentives for maintaining control during marches. These incentives included additional days off and access to property confiscated from prisoners, which further encouraged brutality. Now, what implications did these marches have for the prisoners? The marches not only took the lives of thousands of prisoners, but also left scars profound in the survivors. The descriptions of these events show how the hunger, cold, and systematic violence reduced the prisoners to a state of absolute desperation. A fragment of a diary recovered from an unknown prisoner provides a heartbreaking vision. "We walk like shadows. There's no time to cry dead, nor strength to help the living. We just keep going because stopping means the end." The psychological trauma of the marches haunted the survivors throughout their entire life. Many suffered recurring nightmares, unable to forget the images of their comrades falling and being executed. Unfortunately, post-traumatic stress, it was part of the daily life of these survivors. When Stutthof was finally liberated in May 1945, thousands of prisoners were still on the march or had perished along the way. The force's Soviet troops found a practically deserted field, with only a handful of survivors who had escaped from the marches. The death marches of Stutthof remain one of the darkest chapters in the history of the Holocaust. Beyond the cruelty inherent in these forced evacuations, they reveal to what extent the Nazi regime was willing to go to conceal its crimes and perpetuate his ideology, even in his last days. The League of German Girls, the cruelest women from Germany. In Nazi Germany, ideological indoctrination was not limited to men. Youth's women were recruited en masse into organizations such as the Girls' League Germans, the female equivalent of the Hitler Youth. Through the BDM, the regime instilled in these teenagers the ideals of Nazism, preparing many to play crucial roles in the machinery of oppression, including positions as guards in concentration camps. So how did indoctrination work in the BDM? Well, this was founded in 1932. The BDM was designed to train young German women as mothers of the future and defenders of the Reich. Since the age of 14, participants were immersed in a strictly ideological education. They learned about the principles of racial purity, sacrifice for the nation, and absolute obedience to the Führer. Reports from the time reveal that the BDM's activities were not limited to social gatherings and sports activities. They also included lessons on biology, race, and the duty to defend the Reich against its enemies. A survivor of program identified as Ingrid H. recounted decades later, "They taught us that we were superior, that our blood made us special." At 13 years old, we believed it was our duty to protect the greatness of Germany. With the start of the war, many young women trained in the BDM were recruited for jobs in factories, hospitals, or as auxiliaries on the front. However, as the need for concentration camp personnel grew, several of these women were transferred to roles as guards. Training to become Officerinnen, female guards, included instruction in the use of weapons, surveillance tactics, and, most importantly, the desensitization towards human suffering. The instructors instilled in them that prisoners were enemies of the Reich, unworthy of compassion. Curiously, recently declassified documents reveal that many of these women accepted their new positions not only because of ideology, but also because material incentives. The guards in the camps received better food rations, clothing, and privileges that were not available to other civilian workers. Although the Nazi propaganda portrayed the Officerinnen as loyal defenders of the nation, the later testimonies show that the motivations of these women were diverse. Some, deeply indoctrinated, genuinely believed in the Nazi cause. Others, they saw in these roles an opportunity to rise socially or escape poverty, as is the case of Jenny Wanda Barkman, one of the best-known guards in Stutthof. She was an example of this transition. He joined the BDM at the age of 15, and at 22 he worked as an Officerin in the fields. Testimonies of the time describe how he used his position to commit acts of extreme cruelty, but also to obtain personal luxuries. During his trial in 1941-6, a witness stated, "She was always well-dressed, with her hair done and her painted lips. He seemed to enjoy his power as if he were a celebrity instead of a guard." However, shortly we will be telling you everything about the terrible executions that this woman carried out. This process of turning ordinary young people into perpetrators of mass crimes was facilitated by the cultural and political environment of Nazi Germany. Anti-Semitism, contempt for inferiors, and the glorification of collective sacrifice became normalized in education and propaganda. A notable find in archives of the time is a manual used to train the Officerinnen. This document instructed the guards on how to maintain discipline and administer punishments, emphasizing that the pity is a sign of weakness and that their duty was to be ruthless. In 1944, desperate need for personnel led to the Nazi authorities to recruit even women with no prior experience in the BDM. Our new guards, although less indoctrinated, quickly adopted the practices of cruelty that characterized her companions. A recent document discovered mentions that many of these women used the whip not only as control tool, but also as a status symbol within the fields. WWII, another guard stationed at Stutthof, is remembered for her methods particularly sadistic. It is said that he organized games in which he forced the prisoners to perform impossible tasks, punishing them with beatings or executions when they inevitably failed. During her trial, one survivor recounted, "She had a funny laugh that chilled the blood. It was as if he enjoyed every moment of our suffering." The most disturbing thing about the story of the Stutthof guards is how these women, many of them young and apparently ordinary, became an active part of a system of oppression and death. This phenomenon raises difficult questions about the nature of evil and the ability of ideology to corrupt even those they should represent compassion and care. The case of Elizabeth Becker, one of the youngest guards at Stutthof, illustrates this transition. Born in 1924, Becker joined the BDM in its adolescence and was assigned to Stutthof at the age of 20. Although initially it was shown reluctant to participate in the abuses, he quickly adopted the practices of the camp. During his trial, he stated, "I was just following orders. I didn't know how to stop." The women who went from the BDM to the concentration camps were not monsters in the traditional sense, but they became key pieces of the genocidal machinery Nazi. Their transformation from idealistic young women to perpetrators of heinous crimes reflects how indoctrination and propaganda can dehumanize even those they seem common. But now we will tell you everything these women did that we have mentioned, and which are the main protagonists in this dark stain of the history that occurred during the Second World War. Cruelty, personified, the most infamous guards of Stutthof. As we have mentioned in the horror of the Stutthof concentration camp, some figures stand out not only for their participation in the crimes, but also for the cruelty with which who perpetrated them. Among these figures, the guards Jenny Wanda Barkman, WWII, and Elizabeth Becker became main symbols of the extreme dehumanization that characterized the Nazi regime. Through their actions, these women revealed how power and indoctrination could transform individuals common in agents of terror. The beautiful specter. Jenny Wanda Barkman, who has been mentioned briefly earlier throughout this documentary, born in 1922, she was one of Stutthof's best-known guards. Nicknamed the Beautiful Spectrum, his physical appearance contrasted with his brutality. Tall, with blonde hair and angelic face, Barkman used his image to project a false sense of calm before committing atrocious acts. Testimonies from survivors describe how he supervised executions with a chilling coldness. According to a report presented during the trials of 1946 in Gdansk, Barkman was selecting prisoners for the gas chamber with a smile and often humiliated the victims before their death. One of the most striking testimonies came from a Jewish prisoner who survived her stay at Stutthof. She walked among us as if she were choosing flowers. His face never showed remorse even when he looked into her eyes, who I knew would die. An unpublished discovery in Polish archives revealed that Barkman was also involved in medical experiments carried out on prisoners. Although not all are known details of his involvement, it was documented that he supervised procedures that resulted in the death of several subjects. During his trial, Barkman attempted to justify himself by claiming that he was simply continuing orders. However, the testimonies and evidence presented showed that he acted with a personal initiative that exceeded the expectations of his position. The master of macabre games. Paradies, born in 1921, he was another of the most feared figures at Stutthof. Her sadism made her a presence terrifying for the prisoners. Unlike Barkman, Paradies was known for its active participation in torture and punishment that went beyond surveillance. The testimonies describe how Paradies organized what survivors called macabre games. In one of these games, he forced the prisoners to perform tasks impossible, like carrying buckets full of water with holes drilled in the bottom. Those who failed to comply with the demands were beaten or executed on the spot. In one particularly disturbing case, a prisoner described how Paradies forced a group of women to run barefoot in the snow while hitting them with a whip. "She enjoyed seeing us suffer. You could see it in his face. It was as if every scream it was a victory for her," said an anonymous survivor. Documents declassified in 2020 revealed that Paradies was also involved in supervising the death marches from Stutthof. During these forced evacuations, his sadistic behavior was reported by several witnesses who claimed that he shot prisoners for no apparent reason, even when they complied with orders. The youngest but cruel guard, Elizabeth Becker, born in 1924, represents a different case from that of Barkman and Paradies. At 20 years old, she became one of the youngest guards at Stutthof. Although initially it was described as a shy and obedient young woman, her time in the countryside revealed a transformation that reflects how power and indoctrination could corrupt quickly to anyone, regardless of age or belief. Becker had worked in a factory before being recruited as an Officerin in 1920, 944. Despite his lack of previous experience, he adapted quickly to the camp environment, participating in the selections of prisoners for the gas chambers and physical punishments. A Stutthof survivor recalled how Becker supervised the burning of bodies in the crematoriums. "She didn't say much, but her presence was enough to terrify us. There was something unsettling in the way he watched, as if he were learning from every act of cruelty." During his trial, Becker attempted to present an image of innocence, arguing that her youth and inexperience had led her to make mistakes. However, the testimonies and evidence showed that he actively participated in the atrocities of the field. A curious detail revealed at his trial was that Becker had written letters to his family during his time at Stutthof, describing his job as difficult but necessary for the protection of Germany. These letters, preserved in archives polls, offer insight into the indoctrination that shaped their perception of the crimes he committed. Given so many horrors that these women perpetrated, what was the fate of these guards? The actions of Barkman, Paradies, and Becker did not go unpunished. During Stutthof trials in 1946, all three were declared guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Barkman and Paradies were sentenced to death and publicly executed in Gdansk, while Becker also received the capital punishment, although he showed remorse in his last words. Statements. The trial and executions of these women sent a clear message on individual responsibility for Nazi crimes. A recent discovery in German archives revealed that Barkman, shortly before his capture, attempted to flee across the border into Denmark using documents false. Although she was detained, this attempt highlights how many of those responsible they tried to evade justice after the fall of the Third Reich. Another document, declassified in 2019, included testimonies from soldiers Soviets who participated in the liberation of Stutthof. One of them claimed to have found Paradies' personal records, which included a list of punishments she had been applied to prisoners, along with personal comments on its effectiveness. Without a doubt, unpublished data and testimonies from voices that unfortunately lived through the hell on earth within those enemy concentration camps, and even more so, with guards as sadistic, violent, cruel, and evil as the beautiful specter, Paradies and Elizabeth Becker, who were considered demons within those Nazi concentration camps. Delayed justice, the Stutthof trials. In the summer of 1946, just over a year after the liberation of the Stutthof concentration camp, one of the most important post-war events in Eastern Europe. Held in Gdansk, Poland, this historical process marked a significant effort to bring justice to those responsible for the crimes committed in one of the most brutal camps of the regime Nazi. Those charged included former Stutthof officials and guards, including several women whose atrocities left an indelible mark on the memory of the survivors. The Stutthof trial was held under the supervision of a special Polish court, and it had extensive international coverage. In total, 13 defendants faced charges, including 6 women who had served as camp guards. This process was one of the first to recognize the responsibility of women in the war crimes, a topic that had been relegated to the background in other trials of the time. The selection of the accused was based on evidence collected during the investigations carried out immediately after the liberation of the camp. Photographs, administrative records, and testimonies of survivors served as fundamental tests. One of the most impressive documents was a report written by the Red Army after liberating the camp, which detailed the conditions of the prisoners and the atrocities committed by camp staff. Among the accused were key figures such as those mentioned above: Jenny Wanda Barkman, Ewa Paradis, and Elizabeth Becker, whose actions had already been reported by multiple survivors. In addition, they were also processed male camp officials, responsible for overseeing mass executions and the death marches. A striking description of the trial came from a Polish reporter present in the room. The accused sat in silence, with expressions that oscillated between indifference and anxiety. Some tried to justify their actions as obedience to orders, while others kept a sepulchral silence. The trial included testimony from more than 30 survivors, whose words left the court and the public breathless. These accounts detailed the inhumane conditions of the countryside, brutal punishments and summary executions carried out under the supervision of the accused. One of the most moving testimonies was that of Anna K., a Jewish woman who survived Stutthof and described how Jenny Wanda Barkman he selected prisoners for the gas chamber. I remember how I walked between us, smiling. He looked at us as if we were less than human. I will not forget my sister's last look as they took her to the chamber. Another survivor, a man identified as Piotr S., recounted how Ewa Paradis found him. He beat him unconscious for not completing an absurd task. She enjoyed of power. It wasn't just obedience to orders, it was personal to her. Now justice was just beginning for them as the crimes were verified. The court collected irrefutable evidence of the crimes committed in Stutthof, which included the direct participation of the accused in the selections for the gas chambers, torture and physical punishment inflicted on prisoners, often for reasons insignificant, supervision of death marches during which thousands of prisoners they died from hunger, cold, or summary executions. A document declassified in 1995 revealed that the defendants, including Barkman and Paradis, signed specific orders detailing the number of prisoners sent to the gas chambers on certain days. These tests. They refuted any claim of ignorance on the part of the defendants. On the other hand, on May 31, 1946, the court issued his verdict. Of the 13 defendants, 11 were sentenced to death, including all the female guards present at the trial. 2 others received long sentences of prison. Elizabeth Becker, the youngest guard, attempted to appeal for clemency, claiming that her youth and inexperience had led her to make mistakes. However, the court determined that his active participation in prisoner selections and his cruelty invalidated any possibility of leniency. On the 4th of July, 1946, death sentences were passed, took place publicly in Gdansk. The accused were hanged in front of a crowd of thousands of people, including Stutthof survivors and local residents. This event not only served as an act of justice, but also as a reminder of the crimes committed and a message about the importance of accountability. An eyewitness described the scene. The crowd was silent. There was a feeling of relief, but also sadness. We did not celebrate the death of these people, but the fact that justice had finally been done. A notable discovery related to the trial was the identification of letters written by Jenny Wanda Barkman while awaiting sentencing. These letters, addressed to his family, showed a lack of repentance and a defense of their actions. Everything what I did was through Germany. If I was born again, I would do it again. Another fascinating discovery was the use of an audio recorder during the trial, an uncommon practice at the time. The recordings, preserved in archives Poles, captured the voices of the accused and the survivors, providing a living testimony of the horrors of Stutthof and the impact of the trial. The trial and public executions left a deep impression on the population of Gdansk and its surroundings. For many, they represented symbolic closure and opportunity to face the past. However, they also sparked debates about the effectiveness of public trials as a tool of justice. Some Polish residents expressed concern that the executions would not erase the pain inflicted by the Stutthof crimes. A local farmer commented on an interview years later. "We could see that justice was being done, but the memories of what those people did will never go away." The Stutthof trial in 1946 was a milestone in efforts to confront Nazi atrocities and set a precedent for international justice. Through heartbreaking testimony and compelling evidence, the court was able to hold the perpetrators accountable for one of the darkest chapters in history human. However, the trial also revealed the limitations of justice post-war, since many responsible escaped scrutiny and lived out the rest of their lives in freedom. This process punished the guilty and also initiated a conversation about memory, responsibility, and the need to remember horrors of the past to prevent them from being repeated. Women who cheated justice, Herta Bothe and the evaded guards. In the chaotic months that followed the collapse of the Third Reich, many figures linked to the crimes of the concentration camps unfortunately managed to evade justice. Among these was Herta Bothe, one of the most guards. Known to Stutthof, whose story represents the dilemma of the numerous female perpetrators that escaped scrutiny for decades. Herta Bothe was born in 1921 into a lower-class German family, hardworking. In 1942, he joined the Nazi camp system as Officerin, playing an active role in Stutthof and other fields. Testimonials later, they described her as an imposing figure, both physically and emotionally, known for her willingness to use violence to maintain the control. During her time at Stutthof, Bothe was accused of overseeing selections of prisoners destined for the gas chamber and inflicting brutal punishments. A survivor, identified as Samuel K., remembered her saying, "Her gaze was cold. Yeah, you tried to explain something." She responded with blows. It was as if he enjoyed reminding us that we had no value for her. However, unlike other processed guards in 1946, Bothe managed to disappear after the liberation of the field. Taking advantage of the post-war chaos, he mixed among the refugees and avoided being identified for several years. Herta Bothe was not the only one to escape. Many concentration camp guards, they took advantage of the collapse of the Nazi authorities to flee. Some used falsified documents, while others moved to rural regions or they assumed new identities. A recent discovery in declassified files in 1998 revealed that several of these women were assisted by clandestine networks that operated in Europe, facilitating their transfer to places insurance. In Bothe's case, it is believed that he initially traveled to the Bavarian region before to settle in Hamburg under a false name. Curiously, many of these guards did not stray too far from their places of origin. Upon returning to communities small, managed to integrate back into the social fabric, going unnoticed. But not everything was rosy. Bothe's luck changed in 1950, and one when she was identified and arrested by British authorities. During his interrogation, denied any active participation in the Stutthof crimes, claiming that he had only followed orders. However, the testimonies of survivors and evidence collected refuted his statements. One of the documents presented during his trial contained detailed records linking Bothe to the transport of prisoners to the gas chambers. Furthermore, a Polish witness described how he saw a pregnant woman beaten until she was unconscious. She didn't show piety. The woman fell to the ground and Herta just kept going as if it hadn't happened. "Nothing," said the witness. In 1953, Bothe was sentenced to 10 years in prison, but her sentence was later reduced, allowing her to be released in 1957. Although his capture marked a milestone, many other guards continued evading justice. There are also many cases of late justice between 2018 and 2021. Justice finally caught up with some of the guards who had managed to escape for decades. These trials, although symbolic due to the advanced age of the accused, represented an effort to recognize the crimes and provide closure to the survivors. One of the most notable cases was that of Irmgard Furchner, who she had worked as a secretary at Stutthof. In 2021, she was tried in Germany under charges of complicity in more than 10,000 murders. During the trial, survivors like Moshe D. testified about the atrocities committed in the camp, emphasizing the responsibility of those working in administrative roles. "No, it doesn't matter if they were signing documents or holding a rifle. Everyone contributed to the system that destroyed our lives," Moshe declared. A recent discovery related to these trials was the appearance of letters written by some of the accused to their families during the war. These letters, preserved in German archives, they offered a disturbing insight into his mentality. In one of them, an unidentified guard wrote, "This job is difficult, but it is because the good of Germany. Prisoners are not people, just tools that we must wear." Additionally, in 2020, a team of researchers discovered a list of names in an old Stutthof archive, which included female guards who had not been processed. This finding has led to new research to locate possible perpetrators still alive. These recent trials have generated debates about the effectiveness and purpose of prosecute elderly people. Some argue that these processes come too late to have a significant impact, while others insist that are essential to preserve historical memory and send a clear message about the individual responsibility. In the words of a German prosecutor involved in the trial of 2019, "These judgments are not just about the past. They are a reminder of that justice must never be forgotten, even when it comes late." Very unfairly, the story of Herr Tabote and other guards who escaped the justice highlights both the limitations and the persistence of efforts to hold perpetrators of war crimes accountable. Although some managed to avoid immediate punishment, his actions left an indelible mark on memory collectively and in the survivors. As one survivor said during the trial of 1021, "Seeing someone answer for their crimes, even if it is so many years afterwards, it is a consolation. It reminds us that our stories matter." The traces of barbarism, lessons from Stutthof and its guards. The Stutthof case and the atrocities committed by its guards represent one of the darkest episodes of the Nazi regime. Beyond the documented crimes, the history of this concentration camp leaves a historical and moral legacy that demands deep reflection. Stutthof was the first concentration camp built outside of Germany. We can say that it symbolizes the extension of the Nazi genocidal machinery towards occupied territories. During the 6 years of its operation since 1939 to 1945, Stutthof went from being a center of detention to become an extermination camp, adapting to the needs of the regime to implement the final solution, which we will call that way so as not to say it cruelly. The camp was liberated in May 1945, but the impact of its horrors lingered long after. The subsequent trials, the testimonies of the survivors and the findings in their archives have made it possible to document meticulously the dimension of the crimes committed. However, this process has also revealed gaps in post-war justice, as many perpetrators they managed to avoid punishment for decades. A little-known curiosity is that, among documents recovered in Stutthof, a diary belonging to a Nazi official who supervised the camp. In its pages, it referred to the prisoners as nameless numbers and described the gas chambers as technical solutions. This finding highlights how the regime systematically dehumanized its victims, turning genocide into a bureaucratic process. The participation of female guards in the Stutthof crimes is an aspect which has generated an intense academic and historical debate. These women, many of young women recruited through the German Girls' League, played an active role in torture, executions, and supervision of prisoners. Your involvement challenges traditional gender stereotypes and demonstrates that Nazi ideology, it permeated all layers of society. During the trials of 1941-6, the testimonies of the survivors revealed the level of cruelty of these guards. However, his actions also raise questions about the individual responsibility and the capacity of indoctrination to transform ordinary people into perpetrators of mass crimes. A phrase recorded in the WWII trial captures this duality. "He was not a monster, was a woman common that became something unimaginable." The study of Stutthof and its guards is not just a look into the past, it is also a warning for the present and the future. Just imagine what it could mean if something like this would happen in our times. The atrocities committed in this field demonstrate how an ideological system can corrupt institutions, normalize violence, and dehumanizing entire groups of people. A crucial lesson is the importance of historical memory. Preserved testimonials of survivors, documents, and historical sites is essential to prevent these events are minimized or distorted. In the words of a Polish historian who works on the conservation of Stutthof, "Every stone in this field tells a story. History. If we don't listen, we risk repeating the mistakes of the past. Stutthof also leaves us with several curiosities and several recent discoveries. In 2020, a team of archaeologists discovered an underground cache in the vicinity of Stutthof, which contained objects belonging to prisoners. Among them they found letters, photographs, and small personal relics. These findings have provided new perspectives on the lives and hopes of the victims, reminding us that behind the statistics there were human beings with stories individual. Another recent revelation includes the release of files documenting how some German companies directly benefited from forced labor in Stutthof. These records have led to lawsuits and debates over the corporate responsibility in times of war. Although many perpetrators were prosecuted in immediate or delayed trials, the fact that some evaded justice raises questions about the effectiveness of the legal systems in times of transition. The subsequent trials, although late, managed to shed some light on these shadows, bringing some to justice responsible and documenting the horrors experienced by the victims. However, the suffering does not end with the punishment of the guilty. The emotional scars and physical remains remain, both in the survivors and in the collective memory. A Stutthof survivor expressed in 2018 during the trial of a former camp secretary, "This trial is not just for me. It is for all those who could not be here. It is our last chance to be heard." The history of Stutthof, this concentration camp, which operated since 1939 to 1945, it was not only a place of death, but also a scene where the depths of the human cruelty. The cruelty of their guards underscores the importance of educating the future generations about the dangers of hatred and intolerance. Museums, monuments, and educational programs around the world have adopted the responsibility of maintaining long live the memory of Nazi crimes. In Germany, Poland, and other countries, initiatives such as school visits to historical sites and documentation projects have helped contextualize these events and reflect on how society can resist the emergence of extremist ideologies. Today, as we reflect on these atrocities, we must commit to keeping alive memory, to defend human dignity, and to educate future generations so that these tragedies will never be repeated again. The story of Stutthof is a warning that we should not ignore.